Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. A taxpayer-funded webinar in Wisconsin featured guests promoting controversial positions on gender and race. Joining me today to tell us more is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what was this webinar and who was a part of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, Wisconsin has the state agency, the Department of Public Instruction. They have like a branch of that called the Wisconsin Equity Network, or just the network. So it's like, this just goes by the network, but it's a sub-branch of the Department of Public Instruction. And they use federal IDEA funds. So that's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that is, special education funds directed toward students to give them a fair and appropriate public education. And that is a, longstanding federal education fund directing, a lot of money to that. And so this agency basically directs some of its money toward equity. And so I think that the basis of the equity network is, why do we have, disproportionate amounts of students of color in these special education classrooms? And so how do we try to address that? And so this is an institute, like a leadership institute, I think is what it's called, that's put on by that. But it has a scholarship, as they say, from the federal IDEA funds, right? So they take the money from the feds and they direct it to paying speakers and putting on these 4 times a year, I believe. So this was like the pre-summer institute. So maybe you're still in school, maybe you're just done with the school year, and we can kind of have this conversation about, as you mentioned, like different topics on race and LGBTQ plus sort of issues.
And who were the speakers for this particular one, and what were some of the points that they were making?
Yeah, absolutely. So for this particular one, they had Ibram X. Kendi, and he's a notable author. He's written books, I think, How to Be an Antiracist, or Antiracist Baby, I think even is one of his more known works. And then Laura Monero, who is I believe a Wisconsin area psychologist, and then Andrea Davis, who I believe is like a Wisconsin-based educator and somebody who's done some equity work. So those are the 3 speakers for this particular event. And I think Ibram X. Kendi was the probably largest name. He got the most money. He got $15,000 for his presentation. We filed a public records request to see who got paid what. Laura Monero, she got paid $5,000. So it's just, those are the speakers, right? And they kind of touch on a range of different things.
Yeah, let's get into kind of some of the specifics of what they talked about. You wrote one article about what Ibram X. Kendi talked about, as well as another one about Laura Monero. So could you kind of just break down what were their presentations, kind of what their main points they were trying to get across?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ibram X. Kendi, he basically said, this is kids should be getting anti-racist education, and that the current education system damages children. So he basically said it's not hyperbolic to say that a school that utilizes a punishment-based approach to misbehavior, armed and policed, a school that does not teach young people about racism, that uses cultural and literary examples created by white people, a school that teaches the test as opposed to teaches students to critically think, is, quote, literally dangerous to the minds and bodies of really all the children. So that was something that Kendi said during his talk. He, said we've created dangerous environments for young people, even as we imagine that we're supposed to be their protectors. And I'm condensing a lot. I mean, there's a lot of things that he touched on in like an hour and 15 minutes during the presentation. It was called a generative conversation, by the way. He didn't have really like a slide that he was working through for educators. There was just kind of like a back and forth, and his camera didn't work. So it was just like, it was a black screen there, sort of like technical issues that happened the day of. But essentially, Laura Monero too, she was able to jump on there and ask him some questions. And again, it was like sort of that conversation format, and basically said, look, I've taken your theory and I've expanded it. So you've talked about how to resist anti-Blackness. But I've also taken that to apply to anti-sexism, anti-ableism, and anti-cis heterosexism. And so, like, how do you What do you think about that? And Kendi said it's foolish for parents to claim that their 2 to 3-year-old isn't old enough for a feminist intersectional approach, right? He said, to me, when parents say their kids are too young to understand and study heterosexism, it's laughable because it's parents who are telling their boys, like, stop acting like a girl. And he had some other examples of that. But he said it's literally parents and others in our society expressing sexist ideas to their kids on the basis that they would understand it. So they're teaching their kids sexist ideas is what Kendi is saying. But then when you come around and say, let's introduce the more feminist intersectional approach, and those are his words, right? Then parents claim, oh, well, that's just too much for my kids to understand. And so Kendi is saying it's dishonest when parents make that case. And so that was just like an interesting sort of conversation. Monero had a lot of different sorts of conversations like that as well. So, being able to, she said at one point, we want our children to be queer, that's her vision for the world. So, quote, to be queer is magical. To be queer is the embodiment of love. It is the embodiment of love, and that should be celebrated. So that's the end of the quote there. So it's just an interesting, sort of a lot of different kinds of things. And these are directed to teachers or to, staff in schools who are working on equity and different kinds of, areas like that, right, of trying to lower disproportionate outcomes. But that, to me, is really interesting, too, because it wasn't really clear. And at one point, even the question was brought up, and I like to think it was because Chalkboard has been asking, like, hey, how does this connect to the IDEA funds? And one of the presenters asked Monero, like, has anybody been directed to special education programming because of their, like, sexuality or their gender identity? And Monero said that, quote, that has not been much of my experience. So it's like one of those things of, like, I don't know exactly. And the Wisconsin Equity Network has not really defined, like, what the tie-in to the IDEA funds, the conversation on race and different sorts of things, how that connects exactly. So I haven't gotten a clear answer on exactly how that ties in. Another thing too, if I know we're probably running out of time here, but another interesting thing too is, there's been a lot of legislation recently, and I've written a little bit about this, against divisive topics in schools, right? And so then Kendi was asked about that during his lecture, and he basically said, that it's important to recognize, like, why we're talking about this, and it's because of local and state elected officials who've used the power of the state to create mechanisms in which teachers are worried about their jobs. And so that's a quote. Another one, too, is, like, we know what bodies have the power to prevent teachers from doing their jobs. And most of them are elected bodies. Most of them are bodies we can organize and to drive people who are not protecting our children from those bodies. So basically, we need to move the systems of power so that, Republicans it's largely Republicans, and that's kind of what we're talking about here, that Republicans in certain states have passed laws to ban divisive content. And what they're usually targeting is critical race theory, right, of some of these ideas that somebody is inherently superior or inferior. And there's, like, specific kind of language generally with that. And then, Kendi kind of also said, don't leave the education sphere behind. He said, quote, it's a bigger bang for your activism to ensure that the school system has the capacity and the ability and the resources to institute an anti-racist education. So I think that there is sort of like an understanding that if you can get anti-racist education to students, that's most students, right? That's like the vast majority of students are going to public schools, K-12 education. And if you can kind of get in there and you can get them an anti-racist education, that you'd be achieving these ends, right, of these speakers, right? So I think both of them would agree, like, yeah, this is a good place to do it and sort of have these kinds of conversations and have these kinds of, educational topics.
Well, thank you for your insights on this story, Brendan. It's a very interesting story to follow. I know we've covered this particular webinar in the past, and I'm sure we'll continue to look at it going forward. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Freedom, individualism, limited government. On these issues, conservatives and libertarians generally agree. But where do we disagree? Check out the Future of Freedom podcast for civil, reasoned conversations about some of today's most pressing topics. It's not a debate. Our goal is to provide the best arguments from either side of an issue. Then you decide. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you find your podcasts.